Well, welcome everyone to Boston College and to the Feore Family Lecture Series on Jesuit Studies. I'm Father Casey Beaumire. I'm the director for the Institute for Advanced Jesuit Studies. And on behalf of me and my colleagues, Dr. Robert Merricks, the Associate Director and Editor of Jesuit Sources, Dr. Seth Meehan, Associate Director, Father Claude Pavor, Associate Editor of Jesuit Sources, research scholar in residence, Cristiano Casalini, and Fiscal and Operations Specialist, Sean McLaughlin. I wish to welcome each of you to this important event this evening. I'm especially delighted to introduce and to welcome John and Janie Feore, who've joined us for tonight's lecture, and for whom this series is named. John is a 1968 graduate of the Morrissey College of Arts and Sciences and a BC parent of the class of 2002. John and Janie, thanks for this gift of generosity that you've offered the Institute for Advanced Jesuit Studies and Boston College, and it's my pleasure to be able to welcome you tonight for this event. The Institute for Advanced Jesuit Studies was founded in 2014 to deepen understanding and appreciation of the history, the spirituality, the educational heritage, and the pedagogical approach of the Society of Jesus through courses, workshops, symposia, and publications. This evening's lecture represents one of our works at the Institute, and I invite you to learn more about our mission and programming, all of which positions Boston College as the source for the field of Jesuit studies. Tonight, we're honored to welcome Father John Padberg of the Society of Jesus, who will receive the George E. Ganss Award in Jesuit Studies, and who will offer tonight's keynote address. And then what? The Jesuits after their restoration, 1814 on. John William Padberg was born in St. Louis and entered the Society of Jesus at Florissant, Missouri on the day before his 18th birthday in 1944. He holds a bachelor's degree in classics, a master's degree in modern European history, licentiates in both philosophy and theology from St. Louis University, and a doctorate in the history of ideas from Harvard University. Father Padberg taught history and theology at St. Louis University for 2 years before being named as the assistant to the dean of the graduate school, then vice president for academic affairs, and then acting executive vice president at St. Louis U. After serving 2 years as one of the founding members of the United States Jesuit Conference staff in Washington, D.C., he was elected president of the Weston School of Theology, currently the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry, and that was a position that he held for 10 years. Then he returned to St. Louis, where he served as the director of the Institute of Jesuit Sources and chairman of the Seminar on Jesuit Spirituality. Many of you know that at this very moment, the Society of Jesus is gathered for the General Congregation to elect a new Father General in Rome. Well, our Father Padberg attended both the 32nd and the 34th General Congregation. While directing the Institute in St. Louis, he simultaneously served as the rector of Jesuit Hall, the Jesuit community for the university. So he's done tremendous things both for the internal work of the society and for the external mission of the society, especially in education. In 2002, in recognition of his 75th birthday, Loyola Press published Spirit, Style, Story, essays honoring John P. Padberg of the Society of Jesus. And that collection began with a letter written by then Father General Peter Hans Kolvenbach, and it was dated the 14th of February, 2002. Written nearly 15 years ago, I'm struck by how Father Kolvenbach's remarks remain so very true to this day. Kolvenbach writes, "Your love of God, as St. Ignatius urges us, has manifested itself in deeds and not just in words, although quite often your deeds have issued in the publication of many, many words. Our Jesuit brotherhood has been richly blessed because of your great passion for our history and life. You have not only explored that history in your research and work as editor, you have almost literally lived it, bringing insights from the past to bear on our contemporary world and the society's role in it. And you have done this with great nerve and evident love for whatever topic you are treating. I thank you, Father Padberg, for your many years of creative contributions to our life and work, and wish you many more years of happy service of the Lord's mission. In his introduction to that same book, Jesuit Thomas Lucas described what he believed to be the essence of John Padberg. He writes, "He's a Jesuit whose deep spirituality, humane style, and passion for history have inspired a generation of Jesuits and lay colleagues. Father Padberg's generosity is renowned. He rarely turns down an invitation to lecture on Jesuit history and spirituality. Like the great Jesuit saint and scholar Peter Canisius, whom Padberg resembles in everything save disposition, he continues to preach, teach, and administer at an age when many of his contemporaries have retired from the fray." That was 2002. And what a delight for us here on October 4th, 2016, to be the recipient of this continued flow of magnanimity from the heart and mind of our Father John Padberg. When I invited him to give this important lecture, he was so moved to receive an award named for his friend George Ganss that his instant reply was yes. So deep is that bond of friendship and the continuity of the love of the history and spirituality of the Society of Jesus. So it's with great pleasure, and I want to just add, my class at St. Louis University was the final class that John Padberg taught for Historical Theology 2, and we were the beneficiaries of Marty Palmer's Historical Theology 1. And we had David Fleming for Spiritual Exercises and Direction. So our little group at St. Louis had 3 magnificent Jesuit professors who have obviously made a tremendous impact, at least on the way many of us have turned out in the society. So it's a great pleasure for me to present to Father John Padberg the George Ganss Award in Jesuit Studies and to welcome him to give this lecture to all of us tonight. Would you please join me in welcoming our Father John Padberg?
If I talk a little bit too long, can you hear me all right? If I talk a little bit too long, there is a bar stool right behind me, which I shall sit down on. At one point, I did lock my knees without realizing it, finished the talk and said, "I think," and then flopped out on the floor. I presume that's not going to happen tonight. On the evening of August 16, 1773, Pope Clement XIV, in a formal papal letter, publicly declared the Society of Jesus, and I quote, "perpetually abolished and entirely extinguished," close quotations. On the morning of August 7, 1814, just 9 days short of 41 years later, Pope Pius VII publicly declared the Society of Jesus restored everywhere throughout the world. That's another story. How do you write a papal document contradicting one of all your almost immediate predecessors? But the story of the intended universal extinction of the Jesuits and its utterly unexpected continued existence, an unexpected existence during all those years in Belarus and what we call Belarus and Russia today. A lot of people have written and talked about those years, the suppression and the survival in White Russia. A note of piety, unaccustomed to me, of course, that if people every once in a while, and rightly, will say that, oh, well, you know, our Blessed Lady, Mary, is the mother of the Society of Jesus. There's a feast day for that. I say somewhat wryly that Catherine the Great, who kept us alive, is at least the stepmother of the Society of Jesus. Okay, the Society, after some years, was fully restored on August 7, 1814. Okay, then what? What happened on August 8, 1814? And that's in the years to follow. And that's the question that the title of this presentation asks. And then what? What was the Society of Jesus like at its restoration? What resources did it have? What was its contemporary world like? What was the church like? What did the society think it was to do? What decisions did it take for that time and those circumstances? How did those decisions influence the society in the ongoing years? Obviously, if I attempted to even begin to answer those questions, well, you'd be here at least till 8 and you'd never get through the dessert there. But how did the decisions that were made at the Restoration influence the society in its ongoing years? We'd be here time without end if I just went all the way. So just as the period of the suppressed society, 1773 to 1814, lasted very slightly more than 4 decades, so the period of the restored society that I'm going to deal with tonight also very slightly existed almost 4 decades, 1814 to 1853. No, I won't go beyond that for this evening. Why that time period? Because those years and what happened in those circumstances shaped in many ways things that lasted all through the long 19th century, to quote John O'Malley, for example, all the way up to Vatican II. And they lasted until a response that we hope the society made to the aggiornamento, to use John the 23rd's words, that he and the council asked of all of us. Those 4 decades that I'm going to deal with included, first, the initial hesitant years, 1814 to 1820. Next, the first general congregation of the restored society. And I hope the congregation going on now doesn't have as many conniption fits as that one had. And the response, the election of the first superior general, Luigi Fortis, after the Restoration. Next, the next general congregation in 1829, and the election of the new superior, Jan Rotan, whose governance from 1829 to 1853 laid in many ways the firm foundation for the society for more than the next 100 years. Now, don't worry, if those rather general statements sound all rather boring, I assure you the time period wasn't. And I will try to show you how that was not the case. Now, obviously I can't go into the details of all those years, I shall at times do what the famous English author Dr. Samuel Johnson said. I shall rise here to the grandeur of generalizations, close quotations. A parenthesis for those of you who don't know much about a general congregation, it's the ultimate governing body in the Society of Jesus. When it's in session, it is superior to the superior general himself. There's some interesting stories about that where the general didn't think that was the case, but that's another lecture. Its membership is made up of ex officio Jesuit provincials, some few appointed members, and in the majority, delegates from each Jesuit province elected by their brethren. Ideally, more of the Indians than the chiefs, that hopes. The 36th General Congregation, as Casey mentioned, began just a few days ago with about 200 members. The one I'm going to first deal with had only 24 members, the second smallest in the history of the Jesuits. So, to return to the main story. And then what? On August 8, 1814, there were about 600 Jesuits in the whole wide world. That Jesuit world was almost exclusively located in Europe. At the suppression in 1773, there had been about 22,000 Jesuits all over the world, from China to Chile and from Canada to Sicily. That group of 600 or so was made up of the old survivors and new recruits of the previous 1 or 2 decades. The old survivors, of course, were veterans who had lived on in the hope of a restoration, with all the memories of how Jesuit life had actually been lived and how they had actually carried on their apostolates. The new recruits were men who had entered the society at some time after the suppression, before the universal restoration. How so? Well, Pius VII in 1801 quietly but officially recognized the de facto existence, continued existence of the Jesuits in Russia. Very importantly, he allowed former and even new recruits in other lands to apply for membership as long as they applied for the Society of Jesus in Russia, even though they didn't live in Russia at the time. That began the resuscitation and got us to those 600 or so people at the restoration itself. Those other recent recruits belonged to one or another of 2 groups who in the intervening years had been formed, and those 2 groups each promised that if the society was restored, the members would enter the restored society. They eventually merged as one group, the Fathers of the Faith of Jesus. Its founder, one Niccolo Pacanari, was a man of absolutely charismatically persuasive talent. He really was. He could persuade just about anybody, including a good number of cardinals and Pius VII, what he was doing. And supposedly he had, so he says, despite very little education, or maybe because of little education, he had divine revelations that he was to found a reformed Society of Jesus. Jesuit veterans distrusted him. Jesuit newcomers were initially enthusiastic. And as a matter of fact, the group grew rapidly and had genuine zeal in apostolates, especially education, before the universal suppression in England and France and Germany and Switzerland and the Netherlands. But rumors began to grow about Pacanari's, shall we say, less than pious conduct. Doubts arose that he would really bring his group into the restored society if and when it was restored. Gradually and then quickly, the Fathers of the Faith lost members. They just left. Many of them joined the Russian Jesuits. The Supreme Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office for the Inquisition into and the Extirpation of Heretical Depravity, known as the Inquisition, I gave it its full title. The Inquisition imprisoned Pacanari in 1808 in a Roman Inquisition prison under a 10-year sentence for immorality and quotations, Illuminism, close quotations. We won't go into that for the moment. The French occupiers of Rome freed him in 1809, the next year. After that, nothing is known about him until in 1811, it seems that severed from his body, his head was by chance found and fished out of the Tiber in Rome. All of this was going to make some trouble for the years to come. Except in Russia, the old institutional structures of the society and its Jesuit apostolates and Jesuit life had been almost completely lost in the wreckage of the suppression and then the upheavals of the next years under Napoleon's rule. Remember, the French Revolution didn't just exist in France. It went from Spain all the way to Russia through all of those years. The more than 700 Jesuit schools, gone. The hundreds of Jesuit churches, gone. The foreign missions that had existed in every continent at that point except Australia, gone. The previous precious resources for theological, philosophical, scientific, and literary teaching and research, gone. The large and small religious houses in which we lived, gone. The continuity of lived tradition, gone. And the Jesuit Superior General, completely absent from Rome. At the Restoration, the general, Thaddeus Brzozowski, was living, as we'd expect, in Russia, in the remnant of the society there. But the Russian government was not about to let him leave Russia as long as there were Jesuits still in Russia. So he had to appoint a vicar general, whom he had never met, by the way, for all the Jesuits outside Russia. Not a happy situation. More trouble on the horizon. Remember, too, the society in 1814 had come back into existence in a world that had been overturned, convulsed, not only politically, but also at the same time socially, economically, intellectually, artistically, religiously. And part of that world, especially the governing class, the conservative governing class that came to power after the fall of Napoleon, wanted nothing more than to restore the good old pre-revolutionary ways, including the old pre-revolutionary society as they understood it. On the other hand, part of that post-revolution and Napoleonic world wanted nothing more than to keep the gains as they saw them of the French Revolution and to move on yet further, quite a bit further, to repeat the comment of one of the 18th century radical philosophers. They wanted to move on with civilization's progress until, quotations, the last king is strangled in the guts of the last priest, close quotations. Gentle thoughts. The church had suffered too, all the way through those years. The more ardent revolutionaries wanted to destroy the church. The more moderate wanted at best to adopt it. Napoleon wanted to control it completely. If you had thought of yourself during the revolution as a good, ordinary Catholic, and had seen schools closed, churches destroyed, believers imprisoned or exiled, priests, brothers, and nuns guillotined, all in the name of the famous triad of liberty, equality, fraternity, could you realistically have been in favor of any of what had happened in those years? Could you have been by 1815 any other than a convinced conservative, desiring above all order and a return to the days of yore? It sounds like I'm criticizing them. I don't intend to criticize them. I don't see how most people, convinced Christians, could have been otherwise at the time. Most of the leadership of the church in 1814 was not only conservative, but at times, bluntly, blindly conservative. Pius VII himself was realistic. He knew that things had changed. It was a different world in which the church lived and which it said it wanted to serve. But a very large part of the papal curia was not only conservative, but absolutely intransigent. No change at all. As one of the zelanti cardinals, the zealous cardinals, the ones who wanted to return to the past, was said to have remarked that the French troops that had occupied Rome during Napoleon's time had brought with them only 3 good things to Rome. Number 1, decimal coinage. Number 2, the 12-hour clock. Previously, the major clocks in the Papal States had been on the 6 major hours of the breviary. So decimal coinage, the 12-hour clock, and the guillotine. And the cardinal said, for the progress of religion and the glory of God, the church intended to use all 3. As a matter of fact, the papacy in its government of the Papal States did use capital punishment, the guillotine, all the way up through the middle of the 19th century. Not for heresy or punishment for that, but for the brigandage, the murder, the robbery, and that was occurring among the citizens of the really ill-governed Papal States. So that's part of the background. To return to the 1814, 1820 world, and much beyond that, conservatives in church and state considered the Jesuits as the absolutely natural allies in bringing a mad, mad world back to its senses. So-called liberals, a naughty word then as it seems sometimes to be now, especially the utterly intransigent anti-clericals among them, saw the society as an absolutely avowed enemy of liberty, progress, freedom of thought, of a truly civilized and emancipated humanity. The rhetoric is just wonderful at that time. The Jesuits had been restored in that latter view as an attempt to prop up a moribund church. The widespread anti-Jesuit propaganda that had started in the 16th century Reformation and continued on into the 18th century, especially with the more radical wings of the Enlightenment, continued without abatement into the 19th century. It's been said that more anti-Jesuit books were published in the 1800s than in all the previous time in the Society's foundation in 1540 up to 1800. I remember the first time I got into a section of the Harvard stacks when I was doing doctoral studies there. There was shelf upon shelf upon shelf upon shelf of anti-Jesuit publications, pamphlets and books and so on. Harvard had bought in total, many years before, the entire library of anti-Jesuit literature by some one mad French viscount who was convinced that the society was on the rage again. It was wonderful to see the things. It became utterly boring after a while. They said the same awful things over and over. But that propaganda bore fruit. Would you not have been at least dubious, or maybe more likely hostile, to an order which was now resuscitated, that had been accused of the following in its prime years before the suppression? This is what the Parliament of Paris had given as the following litany of Jesuit activities as some of the reasons for the expulsion of the Jesuits from France. The Society of Jesus was guilty of, and I quote from the decree of the Parliament, was guilty of simony, blasphemy, sacrilege, magic, witchcraft, astrology, irreligion, idolatry, superstition, immodesty, theft, parricide, homicide, suicide, and regicide. The Jesuits taught men to live as beasts and Christians to live as pagans. Their teachings were also contrary to natural law, to divine law, to positive law, and to the law of nations, doctrines that cannot be viewed without horror. Close quotations. That is only about 1/5 of the catalog of deeds that the Jesuits were accused of in that decree. Whatever you may say about it, at least one can say with certainty that the Jesuits were busy, busy people. Even intelligent, judicious people of high standing and reputation were long affected by that kind of a notion of the Jesuits. Let me give one example of people of high standing and great reputation from the early 19th century of our own country. Some of you know this example. Mr. John Adams, our second president of the United States, was anxious and unhappy. He expressed those sentiments in a letter of 1816, 2 years after the Restoration, to Mr. Thomas Jefferson, our third president. You'll find this in all the collected letters of Adams. Quotations. I do not like the late resurrection of the Jesuits. Shall we not have a swarm of them here, in as many shapes and disguises as ever a king of the gypsies took on himself? If any congregation of men could merit eternal damnation on earth and in hell, it is this company of Loyola. Our system of religious liberty might oblige us to afford them an asylum, but if they do not put the purity of our elections to a severe trial, it will be a wonder. Close quotations. Mr. Jefferson was equally unhappy as he replied, quotations, I dislike with you their restoration because it makes a retrograde step from light toward darkness. Close quotations. Both men could have been even more unhappy. Unknown to them, already in Maryland, Jesuits had existed in the United States since 1805, 10 years before the Universal Restoration in 1814. But that comes a little later in this story. What resources did the Jesuits have for their nefarious deeds? Well, as I said, those 600 or so Jesuits had precious few resources. Beyond the 200 or so in Russia, they were scattered in varying numbers in small communities, sometimes by themselves, mostly in Italy, but also in France, Germany, Switzerland, not yet in Austria, and in Kuwait province in Mexico, some in Spain, surprisingly, some in England and Ireland and the United States. They were all part of that recognition of the Russian Jesuits by Pius VII. Vocations to the society boomed, absolutely boomed after the 1814 full restoration became known. It was part of a vocation phenomenon that continued everywhere in the church in the 19th century. There's been no century that we know of. Demographics on this are very hard to find, but as far as we know, there's been no century in the history of the church in which more people entered religious life, male and female, more new orders were founded, more missionary orders were founded than the 19th century. And we grew accustomed in the 20th to think that's the way religious vocations have always been. They have not been that way most times. And though I deplore the fact that we don't have more vocations today, we're not in that different a situation than the church was for many of its centuries. By 1820, 6 years after the Restoration, remember there were 600 at the beginning, it had doubled the numbers of the society to almost 1,200 men. What did they do with them? How did you train them? How did you introduce them into the lived experience of the old society? And accompanying that growth and those questions was a huge demand all over the Catholic world for Jesuits to take on colleges, parishes, foreign missions, the preaching of parish missions, especially colleges, far more than the society could realistically respond to. Why couldn't they respond? Well, the overwhelming number of those 1,200 people were still in studies or formation, nowhere near the end of what would have been an ordinary progress of formation in the society. Then in 1820, the general in Russia, Father Brzezowski, died. A congregation was summoned to Rome to elect a new superior general, to be resident, of course, once again in Rome. The Russian government immediately threw out of the country, out of Russia, all of the Jesuits who were there. The Tsar was not about to have Jesuits in his land under the ultimate direction of a superior general somewhere else. This was an external blow. Much more serious was an internal blow. Controversies and divisions among those 24 delegates to the congregation, including differences about its very existence and legitimacy, the existence and legitimacy of the society. I don't think that question is going to come up at the present 36th congregation. But what happened? Remember, the congregation has the ultimate governing body for the whole society. To tell that story in all its details, we'd be here even longer this afternoon. But in brief, here's what happened before the election of the new general, and perhaps much more importantly, what happened after the election of the general. Peace, joy, love, harmony, concord. Well, you'd expect that, wouldn't you, after the Jesuits, having been almost destroyed, were now restored. Well, think again. After all, they were Jesuits. There were seriously different views of the state of the society and the past for the future. One group of delegates, let's simply call it Group A. I don't want to go into all the details. Let's call it Group A. Wanted to be sure that the Society of Jesus of the future was to be the real, genuine, original, unchanged society as had it existed constitutionally before the suppression. The second group, B, thought that some of the characteristics of the society had to be changed in view of the radically different circumstances of the world and the church after the Revolution. Such changes, they thought, would include, among a lot others, for example, changes in the lifetime term of the general, in the existence and operation of the so-called fourth vow, and so on and so on. This group even had doubts about the legitimacy of the congregation itself. After all, some of the delegates there had been trained in a Russian society whose own legitimacy as the real society of Jesus was in the minds of some people still questionable. Had that really been the society? And in the background, the papal curia was very concerned that perhaps one of the former followers of Pacanari might be elected the superior general. Wonderful time to start. Group B persuaded Pope Pius's cardinal vicar for Rome, the man that runs the city of Rome for the Pope, that the congregation, which had been set to start on September 14, 1820, should be postponed indefinitely. Second, that the Jesuit vicar general, who had been living in Italy and appointed by Brzezowski some years ago, Father Mariano Petrucci, should be given before a congregation the full powers of the general, and until such a congregation would be held later, that Petrucci would have the power personally to name all of the new assistants to the general rather than that they be elected as the society was supposed to do. The cardinal vicar agreed, said the congregation was not to gather at least until the next spring. They were slated to begin that September. Group A, which as a matter of fact turned out to be the majority of the delegates, Group A appealed to the Pope through Cardinal Consalvi, the papal secretary of state, who outranked the cardinal vicar of Rome. Then, at that time, as has been true before, and might we say perhaps true today, a lot counted on who you knew in Rome. And they knew Consalvi, a great, great man. Consalvi persuaded, Group A argued through Consalvi that serious consequences and more disunity would occur if the congregation couldn't be held. Let the Jesuits fight this out among themselves. And if there were any possible irregularities in the vows that they had taken, they asked, well, the Pope could sanate, that wonderful Latin word, make valid all of those previous vows if they had not been this case. Pius VII agreed with Consalvi and said the congregation should start as soon as possible. That's a wonderful way to begin a meeting. The congregation began on October 9, 1814, and went on for 2 months, December 10, 1814. Its prelude had been unusual, what I've just described. Its beginning was, to say the least, even more unusual. First, the provincials who were there, actually had to convoke the meeting finally because of delaying tactics by Petrucci, the vicar general. He didn't want to get it started. He was backed by one of the members, a Father Pietroboni, who had been one of the assistants to Brzezowski, although he lived in Italy and Brzezowski lives in Russia, and he had been the provincial of Italy and one of the assistants. Okay, that's bad enough. At the first session after that, when they just got started, Petrucci resigned as vicar general and as presiding over the congregation, as Jim Grummer right now is presiding over the congregation in Rome because it accepted the resignation of Father Nicolas. He is no longer the general, and so they had a vicar general. Petrucci resigns. But he's the man, the vicar general, who's supposed to run the congregation until a new election, because he too had doubts of the validity. Serious. The next day, perhaps influenced by a dream or the Holy Spirit, the next day Petrucci came into the congregation and said he took back his resignation. The congregation said no and removed him as vicar general. Then it went on to judge both him and that assistant of Italy guilty of ambitus, or ambitioning office or change in the society. Finally, it dismissed from the society both a Father Rezzi, who was not a member, but had been sort of the Machiavelli behind the scenes on this, who helped provoke and orchestrate the doubts about the validity of the congregation. And for the first time in the history of all the Jesuit congregations, it took a scholastic explicitly and seriously by dismissing a scholastic who had agreed with Rezzi, both of them as perturbatores, or disturbers of the peace of the society. There are many more vulgar translations than disturbers. Finally, on October 18, 1820, with peace restored, the congregation elected as general Luigi Fortis, a 72-year-old Veronese from Verona general, the oldest person ever chosen as superior general. Father Nicholas, our immediately preceding general, was 71, the second oldest general ever. Fortis had been an excellent superior and, much more important, a member of the Priest Suppression Society, and therefore a symbol, a strong symbol of its continuity. Okay, we got a general now. More importantly, almost the first acts of the congregation after the election of the general was a decree, quotations, to allay every anxiety and to dispel the obstinacy of any malcontents, close quotations. You could hardly get a stronger statement than what I'm going to give to you in just a moment, a stronger statement of continuity. You could hardly imagine how very conservative the Society of Jesus was to be in its internal life for the next several generations. And the same thing was true in many ways of its external life too. In that decree, the second general decree of this congregation, the congregation decided, as you would normally expect, that into full force, vigor, and validity came back the constitutions of the Society of Jesus. Of course you'd expect that to happen. Well, but then it also decided that all of the legislative decrees of all of the previous 19 general congregations over all of the previous 274 history of the society were to continue in full force. All of the ordinances and official letters of all the previous generals of the society were also to come back into full force and validity. So too was that true of the Ratio Studiorum, or plan of studies, the summary of the Constitution, and the common rules, and all the rules pertaining to every particular office in the society, from the rules for a provincial, down to and including the rules for such offices as the close keeper, the cook, the infirmarian, and the excitator. The older Jesuits who will remember what the excitator was. His job was to see that the brethren were up and out of bed on time after the bell rang in the morning. All of this was to come back into full force. Can you imagine the mentality there? It was seemingly as if what had gone on for the past century, half-century, had not taken place at all. At the same time, the congregation had to recognize that it had to recognize the reality in which it existed at that time. So another decree had passed, wonderfully contrasting. It said that the full 2-year novitiate was to come back into force and practice. It said that not only scholastics, but only priests could do one of that years, of that 2-year novitiate. They could teach. Then it said that the priests who were doing that 1 year of teaching, well, at least, okay, but they should spend that 2nd year in the novitiate itself, and not outside in other apostolic activities. And finally, it said that priests who had never at all made the novitiate at all were at least to do tertianship before they took their final vows. Think about what that inchoate situation was. If the society was going to be at the service of the church, it became quite clear that overwhelmingly in those circumstances, the first things that the bishops and quite frankly the laity asked for were the establishment of Jesuit schools. To take only one example, in France alone in those early years, there were 120 requests for 120 specifically separate Jesuit schools. By 1828, they managed to staff 8 such schools, but the government forced them out of the schools in that very year. That's going to happen over and over again. Very interesting. Very interesting. There seems to have been absolutely no requests on the part of Rome, or on the part of the bishops, or on the part of the society to take on new ministries. I could find nothing to that effect despite the fact we had, had better than 50 years of change. And any indication that the society thought of taking on any new or different ministries. Regular government internal to the society, regular order observed in the communities, continuity with the past, no sympathy for innovation, were bulwarks of those early years of the Restoration. And such was the attitude of the papal curia even more, which we said at whose service we were. While the congregation was legislating a firm footing with the past, the present and future circumstances of the next decade almost overwhelmed the resources of the society. Within those years, from Fortis in 1820 to the next general in 1829, the society increased from the 600 in 1814 to 1,200 in 1820 to 2,100 members in that whole period. In 1820, they were living in 6 different provinces, all of them in Europe. One in Kuwait, one in Mexico. In fact, through the 19th century, during the whole 19th century, that society, as it continued to grow, experienced expulsions and returns probably 70 times on and off in 14 or 15 or 16 different countries. How are you going to run an operation in those circumstances? Luigi Fortis died in 1829. The next congregation in a close election chose as general a Dutchman, Jan Philip Rotan, 44 years old, the second youngest man ever to be general. Father Acquaviva had been the earliest. There had been another candidate at that 1829 election who would have made an excellent general also. But he had briefly been a member of the Pacanari Fathers of the Faith, and the electors were much too edgy about really finally on the final ballot choosing him. He led Rotan on the ballots, which, by the way, became public, and I wish they would now, but there's no chance they will. But he led Rotan up until the final ballot. Okay. Interestingly, too, that 1829 congregation also had to consider a formal apostolatum, that is a formal request for a particular piece of legislation, that had come from some one of the provinces. The request was, quotations, that in effect an effective barrier against the dangers of newness or novelty. Note, they didn't ask for a barrier against novelties or new things, but novelty or newness in itself. Pass a decree saying newness in itself was wrong. Fortunately, it didn't require that, it didn't accede to that request, but you can see the background of the circumstances. How tenuous, how shaky this society still was at the time will come from a particular decision of that 21st congregation, which usually, when I tell what it is, excites either disbelief or delight or dismay or hilarity or any combination of those 4. The congregation decided that in certain circumstances, because of the number of fully formed Jesuits, and whatever the circumstances are preceding the next general congregation, the Irish were to be considered to be Italians. Okay, was it delight, dismay, disbelief? What? At least hilarity. That didn't go down very well with either group, I assure you. Rotan sometimes has rightly been called the second founder of the society. Today, Father Arupe might well have that position. And if you go to the chapel in Rome, the one of them in the Jesuit, there's a statue at the altar of Pignatelli on the one side, Rotan over here with a special bronze plaque for him, and Arupe exactly facing Rotan, exactly the similar plaque. It says something about him. So, he, Rotan, was an intelligent, earnest, sober, hardworking man. He built on the foundation of those first 15 years. In his generalate, from 1829 to 1853, the number of Jesuits increased to more than 5,000. You have to set up structures if you have that large a number of people, and he did. What were the priorities that the man had. First was the work of education. Jesuit schools went from just about 20 to more than 100 while he was general. The second priority was the so-called foreign missions, evangelizing apostolates outside of Europe. Over those years, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Jesuits volunteered for the foreign missions, and you can find their letters. At the time, only the general could assign you to a foreign mission, not provincials. And those letters were called the indipite, the petitions seeking the Indies. You can find them in volume after volume preserved in the archives in the Society in Rome, from the beginning of this society. The Jesuits returned in these years of Rotan to places familiar from the old society, such as, for example, in the East, India, China, Ceylon, Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia. There was, to be admitted, a certain amount of missionary romanticism in this enthusiasm, and Rotan recognized it, but there was also truly genuine zeal. These people really did want to serve the Lord. Perhaps, this is now local in some sense to me here, our province, central and southern, perhaps the very first foreign missionary activities of the restored society, missionary activities, took place in a new nation, the United States, which was still regarded as missionary territory. It started even earlier than Rotan, during the Generalate of Fortis, even though he didn't have the least idea that it was happening. He had been elected, you remember, in 1820. In 1821, 7 young Belgians on their own had decided to join the society in order to, quote, preach the gospel to the Indians, close quote, the Native Americans, in, as I said, what was still regarded as missionary territory. They managed to elude the Dutch government, which was Protestant and controlled Belgium at the time, sailed over the bounding seas, suddenly, rather unexpectedly, arrived in Maryland and showed up at the novitiate, which was too poor, as they told these young guys, we can't even feed our own novices, you can't stay. And they effectively said, oh no, we're staying. And just at that time, the Deus Ex Machina showed up, one of the great snake oil salesmen of the American episcopacy, Louis William Valentine Dubourg, who was Bishop of Florida and Upper Louisiana, and that diocese included the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border and the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, and said, you want to serve the Indians? I've got a farm out near St. Louis, Missouri, and I'll give you the farm if you'll start an Indian school. That may be the first foreign missionary endeavor in the new society. That's another story, some of the strange things they did while they were there. The third of Rotan's priorities was renewed and continuing emphasis on the centrality of the spiritual exercises in Jesuit spirituality. Jesuit life, Jesuit apostolic activity, Jesuit spirituality were to center around the exercises. He strongly urged the original text itself become deeply known by Jesuits and be used in making or giving the exercises, rather than, you ought to see some of them, the paraphrases, elaborations, improvisations that grown up in the years of the suppression. He himself made a new and much more careful literal Latin translation. Notice, Latin translation. The idea of doing it into the vernacular? God forbid, yet at this time. A translation from the Spanish original rather than the elaborate Renaissance Baroque Vulgate that the society had used up to that time. If those years were a time of growth and success, and they really were, and generosity, they were also a time of tribulation, real tribulations for the society. Expulsions continued, depending on which political party was in power. And whenever there was a more general and widespread revolution, the Jesuits were the first to be targeted in 1820, in 1830, in 1848. In the 1820 revolution, for example, while a Jesuit house in Paris was being raided and vandalized, a mob descended on another house, the Jesuit novitiate at Montrouge, which was a close-in suburb of Paris. They wanted to go there to destroy it. Fortunately, very fortunately for us, the revolutionaries quickly discovered in the cellar the barrels of mass wine. So they unbunged the cellars and promptly got so drunk that they were incapable of doing anything else. God works in strange ways. In the years between 1830 and 1840, during those upheavals, anti-Jesuitry continued to flourish. And it continued, by the way, all the way through the 19th century. Again, just a few examples. By the way, all of my examples are only illustrative. They are not probative. See, I get out of a lot of problems that way. In Germany, for example, the really iconic, in German history, the iconic Frankfurt Parliament of 1848 decided solemnly in one of its pieces of legislation, quotations, that the Society of Jesus is forever banished from German soil, close quotations. As a matter of fact, the Germans were back in Germany a year later. In Italy in 1848, Pope Pius IX urged Father Rotan to get out of Rome because of the growing anti-Jesuit sentiment preceding the revolution there. Rotan had to flee in disguise. He was the first general to begin to visit houses of the society in other places in Europe. And how he managed to go through places in France without people knowing about it, and much more unusual, he managed to go to England, which was certainly anti-Jesuit, and stay there for a while. Ah, you see the cleverness of these people. The Pope also had to flee, and he and Rotan only came back to Rome when order was restored, when the French troops came and occupied Rome and restored the Pope there. My favorite example for those years, the anti-government and anti-clerical popular songs were very popular, for example, in France. And the French poet Louis Béranger had one song that was very, very popular with a great refrain, which was sung to the accompaniment of cups and glasses of wine banging on the bistro tables. The refrain characterized the Jesuits as follows, and after each verse they'd sing the refrain. Men in black, whence slither you? We crawl up from underground. Halfway foxes, halfway wolves. Our way of life is mystery bound. Yeah, that's what you want to recite. By the way, it's much better in French. Listen, with the rhythm for the Jews. Homme noir, d'où sortez-vous? Nous sortons de dessous terre. Moitié renard, moitié loup. Notre règle est un mystère. Was used for years. Two features important in those years of the Restoration I've hardly mentioned so far. One is the spiritual and intellectual life of those Restoration Jesuits. I haven't said much about that, nothing at all. The formation that went into that life. And the other one was, well, we'll talk about it as the fourth priority of Rotan. That spiritual and intellectual life of those 40 years, I could deal with in great detail if you wanted to take only one country that, I could be particularly familiar with. But around the society, it was haphazard in some ways from one country to another, except in some way they wanted to see the spiritual exercises at the beginning of everything. Attempt was made to have every Jesuit entering formation in those years, at least to make the full spiritual exercises. By the way, in the very early years of the society, 1550s, so on, there were Jesuits who never made the spiritual exercises in full. I know I've scandalized you. And then how that was done is still subject to debate. It leads a lot of research. The second generalization you can tell by looking at Sommervogel, that 12-volume 1890 attempt to put together a list of every publication by every Jesuit anywhere in the world at any time in any edition or any translation. You can find it in the libraries, including Jesuit School of Theology and Ministry, and they're working on the new Sommervogel, which is an attempt to put available on the computer every work about the Jesuits from anywhere in the world at the present time, and moving back to the end of Sommervogel's 12 volumes back in the late 1890s. The thing you find if you look at that old Sommervogel is that there were all kinds of translations from other languages up to about, many of the classics of Jesuit spirituality in the 16th and 17th and 18th century that were reprinted for use by the Jesuits early in the 19th century. That needs a lot more research too. The second feature important to those years that I didn't mention was the relationship of the society with the papacy. One pope had suppressed the society. Another pope had restored it. All the popes between 1814 and 1853, and it's just those years I'm dealing with now, each in his own way, Pius VII, Pius VIII, Leo XII, Gregory XVI, Pius IX, all of them and the society were mutually supportive. They wanted the support, and certainly the society needed the support of the papacy. Remember, the papal bull of restoration, Solicitudo Omnium Ecclesiarum, had begun by a comment that spoke of the Jesuits as responding to the needs of the church for strong rowers in the bark of Peter against the storms on the turbulent seas that were buffeting the church and especially the papacy. And they wanted the society back. The society in turn identified itself with an increasingly conservative papacy. And people who were opposed to the popes, for example, Italian nationalism or French anti-clericalism or the Latin nations, increasingly hostile to the popes, became increasingly hostile to the society. So to sum up thus far, the society was founded in a period of great change, indeed turmoil, the age of the Renaissance, the late Renaissance, and the Protestant Reformation. And it responded with great generosity and great imagination. The society was refounded, restored, in a period of great change, indeed turmoil, the French Revolution and its aftermath, all the aftermath, political and everything else. The society really tried to respond. I have great affection and admiration. It tried to respond with great generosity and with almost no imagination to begin with. That's a generalization that at the beginning of my talk, I said I would talk about one of those features. Now, let me turn briefly to the restored society of Jesus in a place where all bets were off, the United States, between 1814 to 1853. In 1773, when the society was abolished, and in 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was issued, the Catholic Church had about 30,000 members in the United States, which had about 3 million people, 1% of the population. Jesuits were regularly regarded with suspicion and mistrust by fellow citizens. We were the servants of the whore of Rome and the harlot of Babylon, to use terms which were used in public schools in those years in the United States. The few former Jesuits before American independence were concentrated especially in the pre-suppression parishes and farms of rural America. After 1789, rural Maryland, after 1789, they had one school, Georgetown College in Washington, which was always in imminent peril of financial failure. The society, though, was living under religious freedom now that it had never had in the colonies before then. And in 1805, 5 former Jesuits who had survived up to that point the suppression became members of the society again in Maryland when they affiliated with the Jesuits in White Russia. In the years to come, the society grew immensely and flourished in this country beyond all expectations. For example, in 1850, John Baptist, one of the Jesuits expelled from Switzerland in 1848, a missionary for 11 years in Maine, later very much intimately associated with Boston College, but he wrote from Maine to fellow Jesuits in Belgium, close quotations. The United States is the freest country in the world. Such is the bright side of American liberty. Some other time, perhaps, I shall present the reverse side of that medal. Well, he didn't take very long before he suffered the reverse side. 4 years later, members of a violently anti-Catholic Know-Nothing party in Maine tarred and feathered him in Ellsworth, Maine. Whatever the anti-Catholic feeling among American citizens, and indeed it truly existed and persisted all the way up into the 19th century, the American government the government itself has never persecuted, confiscated the property of, or exiled Jesuits from the United States. Most European countries have at one time and another. And that makes a big difference in the way in which people looked at them. Okay, by 1814, those original Restoration Jesuits in America had grown to about 20, working in Maryland and in Pennsylvania and New York. As I told you about those 1821-23, the young Belgians came to mission territory. We have never been expelled from here, and the society has grown extraordinarily too. In those years, from roughly 1800 to 1850, more than 1 million Catholics came to the United States, 1 million, in the great tide of immigration that had begun. The most insistent thing that the bishops in this country wanted also was schools. Again, exactly the same kind of thing that had happened before. And we tried to open as many as we could. On the other hand, the European exiled Jesuits who came to the United States after they were pushed out of one place or another in Europe were sometimes quite scandalized by early American Jesuit life. And they regularly wrote back to friends in Rome, telling and complaining about that life. For example, American Jesuits went out without the required Jesuit companion. They even went out sometimes at night. Sometimes, even more unheard of, they even allowed women to visit them in the Jesuit residence in that new locale that was called a parlor. In the old society, there were no such things. So, one of the European Jesuits wrote to a friend back home, a Maryland Jesuit, by the way, or living in Maryland. One of the European Jesuits wrote back to a friend, quote, that American Jesuits seem to know none of the rules of the Society of Jesus except the one rule that says the rules of the Society of Jesus do not bind under pain of sin. Close quotations. He would have been even more scandalized by the reputed story that Edgar Allan Poe sometimes came from his house near Fordham to visit the Jesuits at Fordham, where in the evening he would play a friendly game of cards, smoke good cigars, drink a tot of brandy with members of the community. Apostolic endeavor and outreach, you can see. The American Jesuits showed great energy and courage on taking on more and more and more things, and continually wrote to them, we undertake too many things, we do not leave time for the training of members. This is my chief solicitude. I do not fail to preach on this subject continually in my letters, almost to no avail. When the first provincial was appointed, some years, 1860, to be the first provincial of Missouri, he tried to get out of the job by writing to the general and saying, in all my years I'm not fit to be provincial, in all my years as a Jesuit, I have had exactly one full year of Jesuit formation. Close quotations. It didn't work. He was appointed provincial. And he was a pretty good one, as a matter of fact. And now I come toward, but notice toward, not yet at, the conclusion of this talk. Oh yeah, I know you're waiting for it. I tried, in general terms, to pose a series of questions. And then what? What was the society like in its first generation? Not in detail, but in initial general responses. What were its resources? What was the contemporary world like? What decisions did the society make? What I've tried to talk about here. And now, not and then what, and now what? And now what? Here are just a few suggestions for future projects in post-restoration study, research, and publication. I assure you it would occupy any young Jesuits or older ones that would be willing to get involved with these. First, more detailed research, extensive in time and space on that first restoration generation that I've just talked about. Second, the same kind of project on the Society's history from 1853 on, after the Rotan years, up to the First World War, 1914 to 1918. How did the society continue to grow, to expand, to diversify, and increasingly to centralize, while many ways remaining conservative in its inner life and increasingly imaginative, slowly, in its apostolic life? Third, such a project on what I would call the Ledekovsky years, named after the great, extraordinarily influential general who governed the society from 1916 to 1942. In other words, from the midst of the First World War to the midst of the Second World War, when we were coming out of our cocoons. And fourth, finally, maybe the most difficult research would be a project for the years of World War II to right before the beginning of Vatican II in 1962. Great changes, some of them obvious, others more hidden and unremarked on, began internally to affect the Society of Jesus and externally to affect the way the world saw the society in those years. What happened in those years? My guess is probably from the end of the First World War, slowly, to change. A simple question. The word Jesuit was a bad word for most people in the 19th century, except dedicated, convinced Catholics. The word Jesuit, by and large, is a nice, good word at the present for most people. And for ourselves, how did we change from basically with a reputation for a very conservative society to one which is much more open today? How did that happen? There are a couple of research projects, Casey, for you. And now, this is enough for more than a lifetime of research and writing. Some of it will be difficult, but I think more often it will be, if you get involved in it, enlightening, surprising, of benefit to the society and to the world in which it lives and works, and to the church and to the Lord, which it says we serve. And now, finally, I end with a brief sentence, only 8 words, that Matteo Ricci, that great Jesuit missionary to China, uttered in far different circumstances, far different than ours now. But it's a statement that is utterly apt for the story of the history of the post-Reformation Society of Jesus on into the future. Quotations: "I leave you standing before an open door." Thank you. Thank you.
I'm aware of the time, but I would like to open, if there was a question or two that Father Padberg would answer, if anybody has a question that they would like to offer, please. Yes, Father.
This is a wonderful talk, but because we may not have many honorees who personally knew Father Ganss, perhaps Father Padberg could just say a few words to tell us something about how Father Ganss was.
A gentle, gracious, unassuming person about whom one answered the question once, how did he accomplish everything he did? And another member of the Institute at the time, said that the answer to that is in 3 words, an adverb, an adjective, and a noun: utterly relentless assiduity. He was at work day and night. But I'll tell you one of the things that most impressed me. I was impressed by him before, but once I became director of the Institute, and this had been his baby, he founded it, he never attempted to second guess me. He supported me in everything that I did. He gave me encouragement from beginning to end. I don't think he always agreed with everything I did, but you couldn't have asked for somebody while you were doing a serious work and you knew he was good. You couldn't have asked for somebody to more buck you up than somebody such as Ganss. He was a very pious man too, in many, many ways. And from an old German family who talked about my father and my mother, you couldn't have had a more gracious person. Yes?
No, this is question that came up at dinner the other night. A little off your present topic, but you've done the history of all the general congregation. In the cold light of history, was there ever a general elected that, in retrospect, the society thought they made a mistake?
Oh, yes. Father Tirso Gonzalez in the 18th century, of whom it is said that he had never had a job of responsibility in the society other than prefect of a 3-person walking group in the novitiate. And he was elected because he was a probabiliorist. And the whole question, the whole dispute about whether you can follow a probable opinion in moral theology, even if it's less probable. He was a probabiliorist. Most of the society was probabilist. He thought it was his job to convince the whole society they should all become probabiliorists. He would never have been elected, except that the Pope at the time was also a probabiliorist. And he made it very clear that he would like to have Gonzalez elected. How he got elected as a delegate, I'm not sure, except he was a very zealous man back in Spain, and he was engaged partly in the impossible task of trying to convert the Muslims. He wanted to go to North Africa and convert the Muslims. It would have been better for the society if that had probably happened, because he wrote a famous book about extolling probabiliorism. Before he became general, the censors said no. He became general, and he decided to publish the book anyway. His assistants said he shouldn't do it. He said, well, I'll do it anonymously. They said, everybody will know who did it. He went ahead and published it anonymously. It was perfectly clear who did it. His assistants were sort of a civil war in the society at the time, said, you've got to get rid of this. It's a scandal. So the assistants gave orders to buy up every copy of the printed version of his view. I think there are probably only maybe 5 copies anywhere in the world. They bought them up, as many as they could, and stored them in a warehouse somewhere in Germany for years. And there were people who said that there was almost, muted, but almost civil war in the society in those years. He probably was one that would not have been, let us say, the best person who might have been elected. Does that somewhat answer? Maybe there are others, but that's the one that immediately comes. I could think of others, but we don't want to prolong this on into eternity. But that's one clear one.
Would you join me in thanking Father Padberg?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your hospitality. You've been very gracious. Thanks again.